about Japan, you talk about Dominican, you talk about Puerto Rico, you can talk about any country. You have to pay a posting fee to even entertain talking to their players.
Mm-hmm.
When Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier, where was the posting fee?
Mm-mm.
So now there's no more Negro League. So now let's start going back to like, man, that's making me think. Was that done on purpose? See, now what we have to go back to.
Because after a while, you kind of just, you forget about how many teams you've been on.
Do you feel, you're not an old guy, but you've been around the block. Do you feel like an older player?
Yeah, I start to feel it now. I look at, Cano, our second baseman, and he's coming in, he's 22 years old, and I tell myself, what was I doing at 22 years old? And that was when I was in Milwaukee. It was a long time ago. I was the youngest on the team, and I can relate to it.
The sad truth about Gary Sheffield is not what most people expect. You clicked this video thinking you already know the story. The controversial quotes, the Balco cloud, the Cooperstown door that keeps slamming shut. But the real story is bigger than any one moment. It is the story of a man with one of the most dangerous bats in baseball history, who spent his entire career fighting a war he could never fully win. I am Mason, and this is Baseball Icon. Sheffield was genuinely great. Not good, not solid. Great. 509 home runs. If you are enjoying this story, go ahead and use the hype feature right now and give this video some hype. It only takes a second, and it helps this channel grow more than you know. 2,689 hits, a National League batting title in 1992. He was the kind of hitter pitchers lost sleep over. But greatness alone was never enough for Gary Sheffield. And the reason why is the thing most will never stop long enough to understand. If you want to understand how a player this talented ended up this far outside the building, you have to start at the end, because the end tells you everything. December 7, 2025. Orlando, Florida. Contemporary Baseball Era Committee sat down to vote on 8 players who had not made it through the regular Hall of Fame ballot. The room included Hall of Famers like Robin Yount, Alan Trammell, and Ozzie Smith. 16 voters total. To get in, a player needed 12 votes, 75%. The ballot included Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens, and Gary Sheffield. Jeff Kent was also on it. Jeff Kent, who spent most of his career being one of the better second basemen in the game without being a household name, walked out of that room as a Hall of Famer. He got 14 votes. Carlos Delgado got 9. Don Mattingly and Dale Murphy each got 6. Barry Bonds got 5. Roger Clemens got 5. And Gary Sheffield got fewer than 5. Sheffield could not even reach 5 votes out of 16. The committee would not be looking at him again until at least the 2028 cycle. And just like that, one of the most productive offensive players of the last 30 years was sent home again. That moment deserves to sit with you for a second. 509 home runs, career batting average of 292, more walks than strikeouts by 304, numbers that in almost any other era would have made the Hall of Fame a formality. But Gary Sheffield did not live in any other era. He lived in his era on his terms, and it cost him everything after the game. And to understand how he got to that room in Orlando with fewer than 5 votes, you have to go back to where the pattern started. And it started early, long before the big contracts, long before the Balco mess, long before Joe Torre and Derek Jeter and the GQ interview that set the internet on fire. It started in Milwaukee. The Milwaukee Brewers drafted Sheffield 6th overall in 1986. He was a Tampa kid, born and raised in a neighborhood where baseball was serious business. His uncle was Dwight Gooden. Yes, that Dwight Gooden, one of the most electric pitchers of his generation. Sheffield grew up around elite talent, and he knew from a young age that he had it too. His first professional assignment was with the Helena Brewers in Pioneer League. He hit 365 with 71 runs, batted in across just 57 games. Those are not minor league numbers. Those are numbers that make scouts stop what they are doing and pay attention. Problem was on the other side of the ball. His defense at shortstop was a mess. Wild throws, errors that made coaches wince, but the bat was undeniable. By 1987, putting up numbers that fight his age. 17 home runs, 103 runs batted in, 25 stolen bases, 81 walks against just 48 strikeouts. That walk-to-strikeout ratio is remarkable. It shows a hitter with discipline, with patience, deep understanding the strike zone. But even as those numbers were stacking up, something else was building underneath. Sheffield was clashing with his Class A manager, clashing with teammates, and scouting reports were starting to phrase that follow him for years, intentional errors. The allegation was that Sheffield, when he felt disrespected or slighted, would deliberately boot a ball or make a bad throw, on purpose, as a form of protest. The Brewers front office was fully aware of his behavior by the time they promoted him to Major League roster late 1988. They brought him up anyway. The bat was that, but they were never going to forget what they had read. The situation hit its lowest point in 1989. Sheffield was struggling both at the plate and in the field. Then he hurt his foot. Brewers told the public foot merely sore. sore. They demoted him to AAA Denver and publicly stated the reason was in fielding, not the injury. Fielding. Sheffield made the trip to Denver, and it was only after he arrived that doctors officially diagnosed him with a broken foot. Broken, not a sore, not a foot that needed some rest, a broken bone. The organization had sent him down, called his effort into question in front of everyone, and the whole time he had been playing on a fracture. That moment crystallized something in Sheffield that never went away. He stopped trusting the people above him, not just the Brewers, baseball management in general. He decided they would put their interests ahead of his body, his health, and his reputation every single time. And he was going to fight back. When he returned from the injury, the Brewers moved him shortstop, third base. His replacement at short was Bill Spears. Sheffield did not see this as a football adjustment. In his 2007 memoir, Inside Power, he wrote about how white players received preferential treatment and how that reality made him angry. He connected the position switch to race. He believed the organization was making decisions about his body's role based on something other than baseball merit. That belief was not born in a vacuum. The Brewers had also started giving him drug tests that were described as not so random. The connection to Dwight Gooden, who had gone through rehabilitation for cocaine abuse, made Sheffield a target in the eyes of the organization. He felt watched, followed, singled out. Combined with the foot injury cover-up, position switch, he was done with Milwaukee before Milwaukee was done with him. He started demanding a trade from owner Bud Selig. Not once, not occasionally, daily, every single day. He wanted out. Think about what that period looked like from Sheffield's perspective. He had come into this organization as the 6th pick in the entire draft. He had put up numbers in minors that few teenagers in the history of the game could match. He had proven at every level that the bat was real. And what did he get in return? A broken foot called a sore foot. A position switch, he believed, was handed to a white player who had not earned it. Drug tests that seemed to appear whenever he was around a certain person. The relationship between Sheffield and the Brewers was not just broken by 1992. It had been poisoned so thoroughly that what started a talented young player finding his footing had turned an open war. And Sheffield was not the type to fight quietly, be loud about it. He was going to make sure everyone knew exactly how he felt and exactly who he believed was responsible. That instinct, the one that said speak up, push back, make noise, never go away, it just found bigger and bigger stages. The Brewers finally moved in 1992. The return was Ricky Bones, Jose Valentin, and Matt Miesge. For a player of Sheffield's ability, that is a weak package. Told you everything about how damaged the relationship had. They wanted him gone badly enough to take whatever was offered. And that is really full picture of Milwaukee. A franchise that drafted a generational talent, mismanaged his body, questioned his character in public, objected him to drug tests tied to nothing he had actually done, moved him off his position, and then accepted a below-market return just to end the headache. Sheffield walked away carrying a reputation as a saboteur. The Brewers walked away with 3 players who combined for a fraction of what Sheffield would go on to produce. Both sides left that relationship worse than they entered, and both sides, in their own way, helped create the version of Gary Sheffield that the rest of baseball would have to deal with for the next 15 years. Before he left Milwaukee, one thing happened that would define how the public saw him for the rest of his career. In a 1992 interview with a reporter from the Los Angeles Times, Sheffield said something extraordinary. He described a moment where, after being charged with an error he disagreed with, he responded by intentionally throwing the next ball into the stand, on purpose, as payback. Quote, hit like a bomb. It confirmed every scouting report, it confirmed every whisper. It gave the narrative a face and a voice. Sheffield later recanted the statement. He said it came from a place of raw frustration and was not literally true. And when analysts went back and play-by-play data from his multi-error games in Milwaukee, they found that the reality was far less dramatic, would suggest. In games on April 23, 1989, June 20, 1989, May 15, 1990, and April 8, 1991, when Sheffield made multiple errors, the batters only reached first base. No balls sailed into the stands. No fans scrambled for souvenirs off a spike throw. Physical evidence did not match the story. Sheffield himself later said the only time he may have actually done something like that was in the minor leagues, not the majors. But it did not matter. Quote was out there. The image was locked. From that point forward, whenever anyone talked about Gary Sheffield's defense or his effort, relation franchise, that quote was right there waiting. He had handed his critics a weapon, and they never put it down. San Diego felt like a fresh start. For a moment, it looked like one. Sheffield arrived in 1992 and put together one of the best offensive seasons of his career. 33 home runs, 100 runs batted in, 330 batting average, won a National League batting title. He was magnificent. But even at his best, the friction never fully stopped. He found ways to alienate teammates. He made comments about who was getting paid more than him, who was getting more attention than him. Competitiveness that fueled his performance also made him difficult to be around. This is the part of the Sheffield story that deserves more attention than it gets. The friction was not always about money or race or managed decisions. Sometimes it was simpler than that. Sheffield had a way of making people around him feel like they were being measured, found wanting, like he was keeping a mental ledger of every perceived slight, every unfair distribution credit, every dollar that went to someone he believed was less deserving him. Players who play like that can be brilliant teammates when things are going well. But when the environment shifts, or when the organization starts making decisions they disagree with, that scorekeeping mentality turns outward fast. And in San Diego, Diego, it turned outward almost immediately. His salary climbed through arbitration, jumping from $750,000 over $3,100,000. Then the Padres' ownership changed. Tom Werner came in and immediately started cutting payroll. Sheffield was expensive and combustible, and fit was over before it really began. In the summer of 1993, he was traded to the expansion Florida Marlins. The deal sent Trevor Hoffman to San Diego. Yes, that Trevor Hoffman, the Hall of Fame closer. Sheffield for Hoffman. Padres came out ahead on that one in the long run. Marlins saw Sheffield as the foundation of a new franchise. They gave him a 4-year contract worth $22,450,000 to right field. Sheffield worked at it. He adapted, put in the time learning the outfield. But even in Miami, something was off. His charitable work was not something did because it moved. According to what was written into his Marlins contract, community service was a negotiated obligation, part of the deal, required, written in like a performance clause. Critics noticed it painted his public goodwill gestures as transactions rather than genuine acts of generosity. That perception stuck too. His performance remained elite, and the Marlins rewarded him with a 6-year extension worth $61 million. At the time, that made him the highest paid player in baseball. But injuries intervened almost immediately. Hamstring problem, a surgically repaired thumb, played in only 135 games during the Marlins' 1997 World Championship season. The team won it all, and Sheffield was part of it, but he was not fully himself. The body that had carried him this far was starting to show cracks. There is a layer of irony in that 1997 championship that often gets skipped over. Sheffield had fought so hard for that $6 extension. He had leveraged and negotiated and pushed until he got the number he believed he deserved. And then the injuries came, and he could not even give the Marlins full season in the year they won it all. He present, tributed, but the version of Sheffield that signed that contract, version played that season, were not the same player. And right after the ring was handed out, the Marlins tore the whole thing down anyway. The championship roster was sold off piece by piece. Sheffield had bet on himself, gotten paid, won a title, and still ended up no longer wanted to be what it had been. Then the Marlins did what expansion franchises sometimes do. They blew it up. The championship roster was dismantled. Sheffield was going to be... The team had worked out a deal centered around sending him to Los Angeles Dodgers as part of a blockbuster trade built around catcher Mike Piazza. But Sheffield had a partial no-trade clause in his contract. He refused to approve the deal until the Dodgers agreed to terms that went far beyond what they had originally offered. What he eventually extracted was extraordinary: an additional $6 million in salary, a $3 million home in Los Angeles, and $1 million specifically to offset California's high state taxes. That is not a player accepting a trade. That is a player running a negotiation position of strength, leveraging the system to its absolute limit. He got every dollar, and he arrived in Los Angeles having already made clear what kind of relationship this was going to be. For a while, the Dodgers and Sheffield coexisted. Money was right. Production continued. By 2001, the relationship had collapsed completely. Sheffield wanted a lifetime contract extension from Dodgers chairman Bob Daly. Daly said no. Sheffield went to the Los Angeles Times and called the organization liars. He said with total certainty that they had not seen how tough he could get. He demanded a trade and gave the team a short list of acceptable destinations: the Yankees, the Mets, or the Braves. When he finally showed up to spring training, he was late. Reception clubhouse was cold. Of all his teammates, only Devin White made him feel welcome. Everyone else kept their distance. The Dodgers situation, one of the clearest examples of Sheffield's pattern playing out in real time. He had arrived as a high-maintenance acquisition, demanded extra money and a house and a tax offset to trade. Dodgers had agreed to all of it. They made every concession he asked for. So from their perspective, they had done everything right. They had met his terms. And still the relationship deteriorated. Still public attacks came. Still the demand for something more, something permanent, something bigger than what had been agreed upon, arrived right on schedule. The Dodgers front office had essentially gotten a preview of exactly how this was going to go. The moment Sheffield used his partial no-trade clause to squeeze them, they knew who they were dealing with. But they signed up anyway because the bat was worth, and then they paid for that decision for the next several years. Fallout from Sheffield's presence cost general manager Kevin Malone his job. Malone, already under pressure from the chaos surrounding the situation, got into a physical altercation with a fan who was heckling Sheffield game. The entire organization was being destabilized by one player's refusal to accept the terms he was being offered, and Sheffield had still not played a game for them that season. What happened next was one of the strangest and most consequential chapters of Sheffield's career. During the 2001 offseason, Barry Bonds invited him to train in Hillsborough, California. Sheffield was dealing with arthritic knees and wanted a program that would field. Bonds introduced him to his personal trainer, Greg Anderson. Sheffield resubs the Clear, which was a liquid form designer steroid called THG. The cream, topical form of testosterone, and red beans, which were steroid pills imported from Mexico. Sheffield said he told the cream was an anti-inflammatory balm for his joints. He said the other substances were described to him as harmless nutritional supplements. When he asked questions, Bonds told him directly, "Do not ask questions. Just trust me. You are going to be okay." Sheffield testified about all of this before a federal grand jury on December 11, 2003. He described the training arrangement in detail and explained how the friendship bonds had broken down. The psychological game started early. Bonds would refuse to let Sheffield rent a car, leaving him stranded at the house before before morning workouts, forcing him to take cabs. When Sheffield got his own rental car, Bonds locked him out of the house. Final break came when Bonds demanded Sheffield pay trainer Greg Anderson $10,000 for the substances he had been told were supplements, despite having previously promised to cover the costs. Sheffield paid the money, and then the friendship was over. He was named in the Mitchell report. His connection to Balco was documented and on the record. But Sheffield's public response was different from what happened to other players caught in the same net. In a 2007 appearance on HBO Real Sports, he dismissed the idea that he had knowingly used steroids. His argument was simple and pointed. He said steroids are something inject your body. He had not done that. He also raised the visual comparison between himself and Bonds, asking why he did not look like Bonds if he had taken the same substances. The argument was not scientifically airtight, but it worked in a court of public opinion because Sheffield's body had not transformed the way other players in the scandal had transformed. And because the story of Bonds manipulating him, stranding him, locking him out of a house, and then demanding payment for substances he had been promised were supplements, read like a genuine betrayal. The public mostly believed the manipulation narrative insulated him, the kind of total reputation destruction that hit Mark McGuire or Rafael Palmeiro. Came out of the Balco chapter damaged, but not destroyed. What the Balco story also revealed, and this is easy to overlook, is that even Sheffield's personal relation followed the same pattern of professionals. Friendship with Bonds had started from a place of genuine connection. Two elite players who had grown up in the same world, who understood the pressure being that good and that scrutinized. And it ended over rental car control, a locked door, and a $10,000 bill, not over something monumental, over petty financial manipulation and psychological games. Sheffield had spent years fighting institutions that he believed were trying to troll him. And then he found himself in a private house in Hillsborough being controlled by someone he trusted. The irony of that is hard to miss. The same instincts that told him to distrust baseball's management should hold him to ask harder questions in that training room. But the trust was there, and it was weaponized, and Sheffield ended up testifying before a federal grand jury because of it. His agent relationships followed a similar pattern of escalation and collapse. Over his 22-year career, Sheffield fired 3 agents. He eventually decided to represent himself entirely. The most dramatic falling out involved Scott Boras. After firing his previous representative Jim Nieder in the spring of 2001, Sheffield hired Boras. Boras was the most powerful agent in the game. He brokered Sheffield's trade for Dodgers to the Braves in January 2002 and negotiated the removal of an $11 million club option in 2004 season. Elimination opened the door to free agency. Sheffield then fired Boras, represented himself, and signed a 3-year, $39 million deal with New York Yankees. Boras filed a grievance. He argued that his work in eliminating that club option was directly responsible for making the Yankees deal possible and that he deserved a percentage. In October 2008, arbitrator Joshua Javits ruled that Boras could not claim a cut of the entire Yankees contract, but he was entitled to a 5% fee on the eliminated $11 million option. That came out to $550,000. Sheffield was furious. He called Boras a bad person. He threatened to reveal ugly things about how sports agencies really operate. The anger was real. The money was paid. Pattern continued. Sheffield fighting the structures around him. Sheffield losing some battles even when he thought winning. What is striking about the Boras situation is that Sheffield had clearly won the larger negotiation. He fired Boras after Boras had done exactly what a great agent does, opened a door to a massive deal. Sheffield walked through that door, signed a $39 million contract, and then argued he should not have to pay for the key. The arbitrator disagreed, and Sheffield, who had built his entire career on the idea that institutions would always try to take from him what was rightfully his, found himself on the losing end of a financial dispute he had arguably brought on himself. Even his victories had a way of circling back, cost him something. His time with the Yankees brought him back to the highest stage in baseball. He performed, he hit, but the relationships inside the building were complicated from the start. In July 2007, shortly after being traded to Detroit Tigers, Sheffield sat down with reporter Andrea Creamer on HBO Real Sports and said what he had been thinking for years. He accused Yankees manager Joe Torre of maintaining a racial double standard. His argument was direct. Black players, Sheffield said, were criticized in front of the group. White players were called privately into Torre's office to discuss problems. He named Kenny Lofton and Tony Womack alongside himself as players who had experienced this treatment. He also said Torre had told him to his face that the Yankees should have gotten Vladimir Guerrero instead of Sheffield. What made those comments land so hard was the platform. This was not a frustrated player venting after a bad game. This was a deliberate, composed interview on a major national television program made after Sheffield had already left the organization. He had nothing left to protect inside that building. He was speaking because he wanted the record to reflect what he believed had happened, and whether people agreed with his interpretation or not, the specificity of the the names and the situations gave the accusations a weight that a vague complaint never would have carried. The Yankees organization pushed back. A team official offered a different framing. It was not racism. It was a class system built around champions. Players who had won with Torre were treated one way. Players who were new were treated another. Sheffield, Lofton, and Womack had arrived without rings, and that was why the treatment felt different. Then came the Derek Jeter moment, when the interviewer pointed out that Derek Jeter, the Yankees captain, one of the most beloved players in baseball, was black. Sheffield responded with a comment that landed like a grenade. He said Jeter was black and white and that he was not all the way black. He argued that Jeter's mixed heritage and his status as an organizational favorite shielded him from the realities that other black players faced inside that clubhouse. Sheffield told Jeter directly, according to his own account, that the treatment Jeter received was specific to Jeter and did not reflect what others were going through. Jeter said nothing publicly in response. His silence was loud. It underlined everything Sheffield had been saying about the gap, how the institution treated its stars and how it treated everyone else. The GQ interview from June 2007 added another layer to the conversation. In that piece, Sheffield spoke about the declining number of black American players in Major League Baseball. At that point, black American players made up only about 8% of the league. Sheffield argued this was not accidental. He believed MLB franchises were placing black American players with Latin American prospects, and his reasoning was blunt. He said the Latin players were easier for management control. He described it in terms of labor power and economic vulnerability. Players coming from other countries with fewer options and significant language barriers were less likely to challenge front office decisions, less likely to push back, less likely to demand the kind of autonomy that Sheffield had spent his career fighting for. He was not just making a racial argument. He was making an argument about labor control and national power. Critics called the comments inflammatory. They said the framing was unfair to Latin players who worked just as hard and deserved their spots. But Sheffield was not questioning the talent of Latin players. He was questioning the structural incentives that made teams prefer them over outspoken, labor-conscious American players like him. Personal danger he lived with off the field rarely got the attention it deserved. On October 30, 1995, Sheffield was sitting in his white Mercedes at a traffic light in East Tampa. His 7-year-old daughter was at cheerleading practice nearby, and he was killing time. A teenager approached the car and fired a single shot through the driver's side window. The bullet struck Sheffield in his left shoulder, leaving a flesh wound about the size of a dime. Sheffield feigned death to prevent the attacker from firing again. When the teenager left, Sheffield drove to a nearby barbershop and called for help. He was treated and released from St. Joseph's Hospital. He owned 3 handguns at the time, was not carrying one that night. He said afterward they felt blessed. The neighborhood where he had grown up, the neighborhood that had shaped him, nearly killed him. That moment never fully left. His personal life added more complications. His mother, Betty Jones, spoke publicly about her belief that many of his problems trace back to his choices in relationships. She described a pattern of women targeting his wealth. Sheffield fathered 3 children with 3 different women. The resulting legal battles, custody disputes, child support cases, and civil lawsuits. Mothers whose claimed to fear him became a sustained source of negative headlines. His personal life was not a sideshow. It was a constant presence running alongside the baseball drama, giving his critics more material and making his path public redemption harder. All of it fed into what happened at Cooperstown. Sheffield spent an entire 10-year window on the Baseball Writers Association of America ballot, unable to reach 75%. He started at 11% in his early years on the ballot. He worked his way up slowly, painfully, year after year. In January 2024, his 10th and final year of eligibility with the writers, he peaked at 63.9%. Still short, still not enough. 63.9% is a majority. It is a strong majority, and it still was not enough to get him in. Think about what that climb represents. From 11% to 63.9 over 10 years. That is not a player being dismissed by voters who never considered him. That is a player who built a genuine case, who earned real support, brought a significant portion of the electorate to his side. The offensive argument is that strong. The problem is that even after all of that work, after all of those years on the ballot, after all of the analytical writing that made the case for his production, the final number was still short. And it was short in part because the voters who were holding back were not holding back over the stats. They had done the math. They knew what 509 home runs meant. What held them back was everything else. The stories, quotes, pattern, not unremember Gary Sheffield. And for a lot of the people who have voted on his candidacy, unremembering him was exactly what his induction required. The offensive case for Sheffield was substantial. The numbers were real. But his Hall of Fame candidacy had 2 major problems that the voters could not get past. The first was his defense. Historical defensive metrics are not kind to Gary Sheffield. They rate him as one of the worst defensive players in baseball history. He ranks second to Derek Jeter in career negative defensive runs saved. Critics argued that defensive struggles were not just a physical limitation. They pointed to the intentional error narrative, to the pattern of his defensive intensity declining when he was unhappy with franchise, and they connect everything they had seen throughout his career. Whether that was fair or not, the numbers existed, and they were bad. Modern analyticals like Jaws, which factor defense heavily into overall value, penalized him severely. The second problem was the era. Sheffield hit his 509 home runs during a period when offense was inflated by performance-enhancing drug use across the league, 500 home run club, once a near-automatic guarantee of Hall of Fame entry, lost some of its power as a benchmark. And Sheffield's own connection to Balco made traditionalist voters less willing to give him the benefit of doubt. When the writer's ballot window closed, his candidacy was referred to contemporary baseball era committee. That led to December 7th, 2025 in Orlando. 16 voters, 8 candidates. Jeff Kent walked out as a Hall of Famer. Sheffield walked out with fewer than 5 votes, unable to consider it again until at least on the same ballot, Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens also got 5 votes. Sheffield found himself grouped 2 most notorious names in the ED era, sharing the same outcome on a ballot he had been hoping would finally give him the recognition deserved. Now here's where this gets complicated, because Sheffield was right about some things. When he said the Brewers had mishandled his foot injury, the broken foot diagnosis put him right. When he said baseball management put institutional interests ahead of player health, history backed him up. When he raised questions about the racial dynamics inside MLB, he was speaking to real pattern the league itself has since acknowledged, given that Black American representation in the sport declined. His GQ argument about control and labor power, stripped of the inflammatory framing, touched on something real about how franchises have historically operated. Sheffield was not just a malcontent shouting into the void. He was an observer with real insight who often expressed that insight worst possible way at the worst possible moment. But insight does not cancel pattern, and the pattern was always the same. Sheffield would arrive somewhere with enormous talent. He would perform at an elite level, and then the friction would start. The demands, the public criticisms, the trade requests, the agent firings, the interviews that turned allies into enemies. He was not just difficult in isolated moments. He was consistently, deliberately difficult in ways that left institutional wreckage behind him wherever he went. Milwaukee, San Diego, Miami, Los Angeles, New York, Detroit, every stop. The talent traveled with him. So did the conflict. And the conflict had a cost that the talent could not pay. The defiance that won him his biggest contracts, that got him the $6 million in extra salary from the Dodgers, that eliminated the club option Boras before firing him, that made him one of the highest paid players in the game. That same defiance burned bridges with almost every person it touched. Bat was real. Wins were real. Money was real. But the goodwill was gone. And when the voting booths opened, people in those rooms remembered how it felt to be on the receiving end of Gary Sheffield. They remembered the quotes, papers, the demands, the accusations, the chaos that seemed to follow him everywhere. And they voted accordingly. Baseball history is not going to erase what he did between the lines. 509 home runs do not. 2,689 hits do not disappear. A man who drew more walks than he struck out over a 22-year career does not get quietly forgotten. The numbers are permanent, they are in the books, and they are real. Sheffield could hit. He could always hit. The bat wag, violent, distinctive, and entirely his own, is part of baseball's visual memory, whether the assistant acknowledges it or not. But the lesson of his career is not about the numbers. It is about what happens when you spend 2 decades at war, every structure around you. He wanted autonomy. He got it. He wanted to be paid his worth. He wanted to speak the truth as he saw it. He did, loudly and repeatedly, without apology. And the people who controlled the gates to the ultimate recognition remembered all of it. The time came to decide. Cooperstown door is not permanently closed. The 2028 cycle will come. The committee will meet again. His numbers will still be in the books. Whether the vote changes is a question nobody can fully answer right now. But what December 7, 2025 told us is that fewer than 5 of the 16 in that room were ready to separate the career from the man. And in the world of Hall of Fame voting, that is a problem that statistics alone cannot fix. There is something worth sitting with in all of this. Sheffield never pretended to be something he was not. He never put on a media-friendly face and played the game the way the institution wanted it. Played. He said what he believed, fought for what he thought was right, pushed back on things that genuinely deserved to be pushed back on, even when the timing was terrible and the delivery made people stop listening before the actual point landed. You can disagree with how he handled every situation and still recognize that the underlying grievances were often real. Broken foot was real. Drug test targeting was real. The racial dynamics inside baseball organizations have been well documented by people far fewer enemies than Sheffield. He was not making all of it up. He was a complicated person speaking complicated truths in ways that made it easy for one to dismiss him exactly that. But here's the thing about burning bridges. Once they are gone, they are gone. The people Sheffield burned were not just random bystanders. They were franchise executives, media members, Hall of Fame voters, people whose institutional memory is long and whose forgiveness, once exhausted, rarely comes back on its own. Every press conference where he called someone a liar, every interview where he went on the offensive, every contract demand that turned a potential ally into an adversary, those moments compounded. They formed a picture. And that picture, the time December 2025 arrived, was not a picture that 16 voters could look past in large enough numbers. Gary Sheffield gave baseball everything he had to white line. Nobody who watched play could argue otherwise. The swing was violent and gorgeous and terrifying. The production was consistent across 2 decades and half a dozen teams. He played hurt, played through surgeries. He adapted new positions in new cities more times players ever have. And then, after everything, the institution he spent his career fighting looked at all of it and said, not yet, maybe not ever. That is the sad truth, that the same fire that made him one of the most dangerous hitters of his generation also made him one of the most difficult people baseball has ever tried to honor. He burned too many of the right people. He said too many of the wrong things at wrong times, fused winning, arguing relationships. And the Hall of Fame is at its core a relationship vote. He could hit. That will never be taken away from. Baseball will remember the bat long after votes are forgotten. But talent alone does not protect. Have spent a career making enemies of the very people holding the ballots. That is the real Gary Sheffield story. If you learned something today or just enjoyed the deep dive, go ahead and like this video, subscribe to Baseball Icons so you never miss a story like this one, and drop your honest take on Gary Sheffield down in the comments below. If you think the Hall of Fame eventually lets him in? Let us know.